Well, welcome to everyone that did make it here on time. Music 101. We're going to explore the very basic issues associated with being a songwriter, all the things that you need to know to make sure that you're properly protecting and collecting the revenues that are being generated from your music. This presentation is part of Copyright Advocacy Month at the Dramatists Guild. And I am Deborah Murad, and I am coming to you actually as my last day of being Director of Business Affairs at the Dramatists Guild. So I'm going off with a bang here. It's great. But as of next week, I'm actually going to be moving to a new position as the Executive Director of DG Copyright Management, which is the co-host of this event. So I'm perfectly situated to moderate today. I just wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about what the DGCM is, because many of you may not know. It's a newer organization. Check us out, thedgcm.org. I always forget to say that, so I'm just going to pin it up top there. But the DGCM is a copyright management and intellectual property consultancy that was formed by the Dramatists Guild to manage the properties that were owned by or bequeathed to the Guild and its sister organizations. So what we are is a public benefit corporation, which distinguishes us from other management groups, because what we're able to do is prioritize authorial intent over any other consideration. So while most organizations might or individuals might go after only profits, we really like to build our work around the author, what the author would have wanted. And how do we find out what your authorial intent is? Well, we get to know you. We store documents that you'll provide us based on what you want your authorial intent to be, comments about the work. We try to get a sense of who you are. Would you want your work to evolve over time? Do you feel strongly about characters, time, place, genders not changing? Is that something that you would be interested in? We also have the benefit of being part of the DG family and a very strong connection to DG. So we actually have a guild subcommittee of the council that will help make authorial decisions so that you can be sure that your work is always being cared for and decisions are being made by people who actually do know what they're talking about and are sensitive to your concerns as an author. We also focus a lot on legacy. How do you want to be remembered? It's always our desire to keep your work relevant and your legacy strong over time. You know, enrollment with the DGCM is really about supporting the organizations that have been there for you throughout your life and supporting the next generation of playwrights, lyricists, and composers. It's great for someone who may not have an heir that they can gift to, or someone that doesn't want to burden their heirs with copyright administration, but they still want that heir to get a stream of income. And it's actually that little part that's what brought us here today. You know, Irving Graham was an author, a lyricist, composer who left the Dramatists Guild a portfolio of about 250 plus songs. The DGCM now is being called upon to take a look at that portfolio, try to untangle it, try to help administer it, get people like Sean here involved in our and he's actually Concord is one of our partner organizations. So get people involved in and what can we do with these works and what can we do in terms of untangling it. And what I found right away was that I was confused and overwhelmed, and music was not as clear cut as I had hoped it would be as an industry. And the more I learn about it, the more I realize that that's what everybody says. So I don't feel alone anymore, but I do need help. And I thought it might be a good opportunity to help other guild members. So we have here with us today the incredible Sean Patrick Flavin of Concord, and he was the president of Concord Theatricals years ago, but now he's actually the chief theatricals executive for Concord. But he's much more than that, because he's also a producer of Tony and Grammy award-winning shows and albums. He's got years and years and years of experience as a licensing executive, a music publisher, show producer, record producer, conductor, arranger, which is really cool, a composer, a playwright himself. So we are very, very, very grateful and fortunate to have him with us here today to talk a little bit about music. So welcome.
Thanks, Deborah. I was also a restaurant health inspector in a long time ago. So,
Were you really?
it's important to have a varied life, but yeah.
I'm actually very curious. How did you start out? And this was not one of my predetermined questions, but how did you end up where you are? Like what got you on the path of?
I grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota, in a political family, and my parents were very encouraging about music and theater, and so I started singing and playing trombone in church choir in grade school, and then playing acting and writing in high school. And I went to undergrad at Boston College and did English and music there, and then went to the NYU Tisch Graduate Musical Theater Writing Program right after college, and spent about 5 years as a freelance music person doing arranging and orchestrating and conducting and music copying and fetching coffee for famous composers, and then got more interested in the business side. And went back and got another master's in arts management, not because I wanted another degree, but there was just too many things I didn't know. I had worked in a number of producers' offices, but I hadn't had a class with numbers in it higher than 128 since high school. And then I worked for a number of Broadway and off-Broadway producers. I ended up running the Melting Pot Theater for 4 years. As a managing director with Larry Hirschhorn, and I helped start Theatrical Rights Worldwide, the licensing agency. I had already worked for MTI and R&H. And then I ran theater for Warner Music for 8 years, and worked with a lot of songwriters and record labels there. And then left there to join Concord, originally in a joint venture with Andrew Lloyd Webber, called The Musical Company, and then as Concord acquired a lot of other theatrical companies, including Rodgers and Hammerstein and Thames Whitmark and Samuel French, we put them all together into Concord Theatricals. So Concord is, most people know the name from the jazz label, which is still part of the company, but it's now the 5th largest music company in the world. So we have 7 or 8 record labels. We have about 500,000 songs in our music publishing catalog. And then we have this theatricals division, which is show licensing, stock and amateur licensing. It's music publishing for theater writers, it's cast recordings, and it's investing and producing first-class work. So that part of the company has really only been around in its present form for about a year, but it's been building up over the last few years. So I've spent about 25 years in New York working in theater, and about half of them have involved some form of music publishing.
That's awesome. So you know a little something here today.
I hope so.
So, we're going to start at the really basic level. And I think that the thing that gets really confusing very quickly in music is that we're often talking about 2 different copyrights at the same time. The copyright for the composition and the copyright in the sound recording. Do you want to talk a little bit about that distinction?
Sure. Actually, let's start with talking about this. Since this is the Dramatists Guild thing, let's focus also on, since we're mostly talking about theatrical songwriters, we're talking about the use of the songs separate from the show itself for the most part. And so it's a distinction between grand rights, which is most often your show or a chunk of your show being performed on a stage with costumes and lights and dialogue and other things, and small rights, which are the rights in the individual songs. There's some places where they sort of overlap, like cast albums, and musicals, but mostly we're talking about that. So in terms of the copyright, there's the copyright in the song itself and the copyright in the sound recording of that song. And so it's a one-to-many relationship. You can have one song that has any number of cover recordings, whether they're by theater singers or pop singers or whatever. And there are 2 different copyright forms. So as a songwriter, you mostly need to worry about the PA copyright form as opposed to the SR copyright form, unless you're making commercial recordings of your work as well.
That's at the Copyright Office.
Yes,
yeah.
right.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that's the one that they use to register
Correct.
the song. Okay.
Yeah. And so when you look at, if you look at an album, not a lot of pop albums have detailed liner notes anymore, but if you look at a theater album, which most do, you'll see a copyright credit for the songwriters, and then you'll see a separate copyright credit for usually the record label or an entity that's licensed the rights to the record label.
Okay, so that's where it starts to get confusing, because now we've got all these different people too. Because when we're writing the show and we're putting on the show in the theater, we kind of know who the people are. We got the producer and the writer and the actor and the director, and you know, then we start to have different people representing the songwriter, and then different people representing the record. So let's just break it down super simple. So we have the songwriter and the recording artist, and
right.
who are the people representing these? Like, you have a music publisher. So does that person represent the songwriter?
Yeah. So typically in theater, songs tend to be written by one or two people. In the pop and urban worlds, they're often written by 8 or 10 people. So in the theater world, it's usually the 1 or 2 songwriters who have written the song, and the rights in the song, each song, are split into 2 parts, not just for the 2 people, but in general in 2 parts. There's a writer share and a publisher share. The writer share is by default owned by the writers. The publisher share, you can make a deal with the music publisher to either sell them a piece of that copyright, or give them a piece or sell them a piece for a limited amount of time, or you can do in most common in theater songwriters is an administration deal where the music publisher administers the song on your behalf, but they don't own the copyright. They take a piece of the publisher's share in exchange for the work that they do to administer that work. You don't have to have a music publisher. You can create a music publishing entity that doesn't necessarily have to be its own corporation. It can just be a DBA, and assign your rights to that. But as we'll talk about later, there are different kinds of exploitations of the song. You'll want to make sure that you're collecting, whether you're doing it yourself or you having a music publisher, that you're collecting on both halves of that song. And then within that song, or within those halves, you can have it broken up. Let's say if there's a composer and a lyricist, to use a simple example, and it's a 50-50 split, then each half of the song has a quarter that's a writer share, publisher share. And you don't have to have the same music publisher for all the writers on the song.
Mm-hmm. But now the difference, just to be really clear, the difference between the administrator, the copyright administrator, I guess the publishing administrator, and then the music publisher. What is the music publisher doing that the administrator isn't doing, or vice versa?
It's the same thing. It's just the administrator. The administrator is just whether it's what's called a co-publishing deal, where the publisher buys a piece of your publisher share, or the administrator who just administers the publisher share of your copyright for a given amount of time. So that's really a description of the kind of deal you have with a music publisher, as opposed to the function. The function is the same. So in terms of function, the music publisher's job is to first make sure that they're collecting your income for the song in all sorts of exploitations that we'll talk about. And when we say exploitation, we mean it in the positive sense. It's making money for you. And then they're also promoting it in various ways. And so that can take a lot of different forms. That can mean that they're trying to get a recording artist to record it. They're trying to get performers to perform it in concert. They're working on the sheet music. They're trying to pitch it for uses in other media like film and TV and advertising. So we'll get to that in a bit. But that's essentially what the music publisher or music publishing administrator's job is.
I mean, it's sort of an interesting point too with the copyright, because we're very adverse to giving portions of our copyright in theater.
Yeah.
So I was very surprised to see that that was sort of happening in music. I mean, for a theater writer, should they be going into that publishing deal saying, no, I'm going to keep my copyright? Is that an odd position to take, or is it?
Not for theater writers, no. And it hasn't been for theater writers since, I would say, the 70s. In the olden days, when you think about the American songbook and the classic songs that are oftentimes originated in musical theater but became pop songs. So the Gershwins, Rodgers and Hart, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Cole Porter, any number of other classic writers. If you've read about that sort of time in Tin Pan Alley, it was, you'd have these songwriters who would come and trying to get a music publisher to buy the song and then promote it, right? And typically in those deals, this is going back to the turn of the century to the 1950s in particular, they would purchase the publisher's share of that song. And so they would own it ostensibly for life of copyright, although as we'll talk about later, that those rules have changed in terms of terminations and reversions, at least in the US and BRTs. But that was the standard deal. They would literally buy you'd get the writer's share of your song, but you would sell them the publisher's share, which they would administer and keep. As time went by, that piece that they would buy has gotten less. So in the pop world, a typical co-publishing deal would be they would buy half of your publisher's share. So you would keep 75% of it, they would own 25% of 100%. We should have colorful pie charts for this. In the theater world, because in particular, because of the Dramatists Guild and the general feeling that people should own their own copyrights, most often what's done now is an administration deal. So you do a deal with a music publisher for a given period of time. It can be 3 to 5 years, it could be longer. The publisher generally pays in advance to the songwriters. And then recoups that advance against income that comes in against the songs. Really a lot of the difference between a co-pub deal and an admin deal is the size of the advance. So particularly if somebody's just starting out. So if a music publisher, if you were talking about, say, the pop or hip hop world in particular, or Nashville, if you're just starting out, but somebody at the publishing house thinks you're, really great and you're going to have a chance at having genuine, radio hits and pop hits, as a songwriter, they're probably going to pay you a bigger advance, not only because of the income potential, but because they'll own a piece of the copyright, right? They're sort of taking a chance on you. It's sort of the old school recording contract thing for a garage band, saying like, here's a bunch of money, we're advance you the money to make the record, and then we're going to recoup it and pay you a royalty eventually. In the case of music publishing, it's a little bit different. And so most often, I've done a few co-pub deals for theater writers, but most of them are administration deals. So at the end of that administration term, you can decide to continue with that publisher or get your rights back and go to a different publisher, whatever you choose. But we're only helping you with it. We're not owning it.
Owning it, okay. Let's talk a little bit about the varied uses of music. Obviously, when we talk about copyright, we've got this bundle of rights. We've got, the right to reproduce, display, perform, and the list goes on and on and on. And these actually amount to real rights in the world. They're not just taglines anymore. So we've got the performance, right? So okay. We have the right to perform it because we're the copyright owner. So what does that mean, perform? And this can get a little bit, I'm sure there's a ton of questions that are going to come out of this just because that does come up so much in theater writing as well. But
sure.
Let's talk about it. So perform.
Right. So performance can be something obvious, like literally performed in a concert on a stage, and that can range from Carnegie Hall to a dive bar, 54 below, what have you. So it's live performance. It's also radio broadcast. In most of the world, songwriters are compensated for performance on the radio, even though it's a little bit counterintuitive because it's obviously playing back a recording over the radio. But the idea being performance, when you think about it in this context, performance is really if more than one person can hear it, right? Potentially. So it's in the US at least, it's live performance, it's radio play, it's television broadcast, it's digital radio broadcast, things like Sirius XM. Mm-hmm. It is, there's a component to it for digital, for streaming services, what we call DSPs, digital service providers, because if you play a song on, let's say Spotify, someone else can hear it, mm-hmm. And in other countries, they also collect on theatrical film performance. So like if there's a component to score or songs played in a film in a movie theater, you would get paid on that too. So performance rights came about because there were, the turn of the last century, there were a lot of prominent songwriters who were not getting paid on those sorts of things. They might occasionally get paid on a big concert performance, but as radio and television started up, and really as the realization that there's a value in having written that song, and that song is making money for a performer or a concert promoter or venue. So ASCAP arose originally sort of pioneered by the popular songwriters of the day and some classical composers of the day, a lot of whom were theater writers, Gershwin and Irving Berlin and others. The idea there was that songwriters should be paid for those performances. And as the idea of performance grew in radio and TV and other things, that got folded in. So the way that it was able to be conceived is that that ASCAP would license a venue, and then the venue would be obligated to keep track of what was paid there. In some cases, ASCAP would audit it. As radio stations came about, they would do large-scale licenses with radio stations. They would do licenses with bars that were playing live music or playing pre-recorded music, whether it was from the radio or something else. And so that was a big driver. And the thing, there was shortly thereafter, a few decades later, there was BMI, Broadcast Music International, and now there are a few other performing rights organizations. But there was an antitrust concern at the time because specifically for ASCAP and BMI, which some of you may have read about in recent legislation and court proceedings, because they're doing what are called blanket licenses. So if a venue does a license with ASCAP or BMI, it's for all of the repertoire that the songwriters have registered with one or the other. And so, when those were the only two games in town, if you had a license with both, it covered pretty much anything that would be played in your venue. But that led to, questions of anti-competitive practices and whatnot. And so ASCAP and BMI are still around, still very strong. They represent all sorts of genres, each of them. There's now Global Rights, there's CSAC, there's a couple other sort of startups. So what ASCAP and BMI are trying to do lately that you've read about is try to revise those consent decrees that affect how they operate. because their competitors in the marketplace don't have those consent decrees that govern how the rates are calculated. Anyway,
Yeah.
the point being that's more relevant to this is, if you're a songwriter, you should register with ASCAP or BMI or CSAC or one of the others, and they will collect on your behalf as a songwriter your performance income. If you also register as a publisher member, and again, you don't have to have a corporate entity for this, you can just come up with a name that isn't already in their system. That's the one rule, and it can be ridiculous. They will also collect your publisher's share. And if you don't have a music publisher, they'll pay it directly to you. If you do, they'll pay it to your music publisher. But they always pay the writer's share directly to the writers. So regardless of what the publisher is doing for you, the writer's share gets paid to you.
So do you only have to register for one of these organizations?
You can only register for one at a time. Yeah.
Okay. So you can only register for one at a time. And if you would like to swap, is that something you can do? Say you got, okay.
You can.
All right. And if you do nothing in terms of, sorry, Sean, I'm confused. If you do nothing and you're the songwriter and you've now registered for ASCAP, the publisher share will automatically default to you?
Only if you've registered as a publisher also.
So what if you don't? And then there's like that 50%, right? Because it's split 50-50. So what happens to the 50% if you fail to?
You don't get paid on it. They have an internal crediting system. So different kinds, it's very complicated and it's not worth getting into now because I've been doing this a long time and I don't fully understand how all of it works. But you get a certain amount of credits if your song is played on the radio frequently. You get a certain amount of credits if your song is the theme song to a TV show that's been running for seasons or is in syndication. You get a certain amount of credits if your symphony is played a lot in different venues around the country, that kind of thing. But if you don't have that half registered, you're not going to get paid on that half. So it's worth registering it. I should know this off the top of my head. I think ASCAP still charges a nominal one-time fee to join. BMI does not. But the fee is so low that it's sort of immaterial.
And you would have to then put every song that you've written into their system.
Yeah, they have a web portal and you register your songs in there. If you have a music publisher and you write a new song and you deliver that song to the music publisher will register it for you. Okay,
so that could be helpful if we have someone helping us. If not, make sure you register as a songwriter and a publisher.
Yep.
That's key, I think. I wanted to just touch about one more thing about the ASCAP BMI. Sometimes it's a little off topic, but a lot of people write shows that are like these jukebox musicals or just put together a cabaret evening and they try to fall under like these blanket licenses. I mean, is that something that ASCAP will talk you through and help you out with to figure out if you're falling under that? I guess the question is to try to avoid getting the rights from the author, which might be a more difficult task.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a few different questions there. All right. So first of all, ASCAP and BMI only deal with small performing rights. So they will not collect in this country. PROs do not collect on song performance within a musical. So even if it's, let's pick one, Jersey Boys, for example, which I have nothing to do with, but when that show is running on Broadway or in any theater in the country, ASCAP and BMI are not collecting on that. That performance royalty is paid by the producers to the authors, or the music publishers, it is paid to the music publishers generally in proportion to what it would be paying, the composer lyricist share would be paid on a show, divvied up amongst the songs that are in the show, because not all the songs typically in a jukebox show, even if if it's featuring the same artist, they're not all going to be by the same publishers. Mm-hmm. So, but to the second part of your question, if you write a jukebox show, if you write the book to a jukebox show, ASCAP and BMI are not involved in helping you get the rights. you can sometimes use their public databases to look up who the publishers are on the songs you want to use, and then go to those publishers and try to make a deal. They do have basic contact information in there. But if you're really going to embark on a jukebox show, it's best. We covered this in another panel that Ralph and I did with some other panelists a few months ago. But it's really best to find a music clearance person who can help you go find out who the rights are. In the same way that you would if you were adapting a work into a play or a musical, an underlying work. You need to make sure you're going to the right rights holders to make sure your rights are cleared. So yes, ASCAP and BMI specifically will waive off on collecting any grand rights use.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the right of reproduction, so the right to reproduce this copyrighted material, which really comes down to, I think, mechanical licenses and these music downloads of streamed music. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be putting my foot in my mouth. So.
No, it's the same. So okay, so this is not dissimilar to performance right. It is the reproduction right can take a few different forms. Let's take the most obvious example. One is sheet music, right? So you know, sheet music, whether it's physical or digital download of an image that you can print or read off a screen, that's one kind of reproduction. The most common kind of reproduction in the context you were just talking about is what's still called a mechanical right, because it's a mechanical reproduction of sound. So obviously that started with wire spools and wax cylinders and went to LPs and cassettes and CDs and other things. So, and now, so there's essentially currently three or four formats, I guess, if you want. There's physical, which is broken down into CDs and vinyl at the moment. Then there's what we call DPD, digital permanent download. So the iTunes store or the, I think what used to be called an Amazon MP3, where you would literally buy for usually $10, you know, the permanent files that would come to your computer or your phone for the album or the track. And then there's streaming, which is, you know, there's no file download. It's just sending a stream of the audio stream to your device. Mechanical licensing is one of the few areas that the federal government regulates heavily. We made some progress on it with the Music Modernization Act last year, but that's going to take a little while to come to fruition. So for a very long time, the federal government has set through the Copyright Rate Board rates for what what essentially record labels have to pay, or now streaming services have to pay, to songwriters and publishers for the recording of that song, whether it's the first recording or the 10 millionth. The rate has been for quite a while for CDs, or anything physical and permanent downloads, is 9.1 cents per song. There's a long song formula that almost nobody ever uses. Most theater writers are going to encounter that basic mechanical rate, and it's a statutory rate. Also, after a song has been recorded once, anyone can record a cover of that song as long as they pay that compulsory statutory rate. And you can do that either directly with the music publisher or through the Harry Fox Agency, which used to be sort of the big clearinghouse of all those things. It still is for some smaller uses, but a lot of mechanical licensing is now done directly from publishers. Harry Fox helps you, if you don't know who the publisher is and you really want to record your cover album of, you know, the Beatles songs, Harry Fox will help you find out who publishes the Beatles. It's Sony. So Harry Fox is sort of a registry database of of publisher and songwriter information for each song. It's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty good.
So what does the author have to do to make sure that they're like capitalizing on this and getting the money? I mean, should they be registering with Harry Fox? Sounds like maybe if you don't have to deal with Harry Fox, maybe not, because they don't pick, yeah.
Right. You could do it. I mean, keeping in mind that the songwriter always retains what's called a first use mechanical. So nobody can go out and record your songs from your musical when you have never authorized a recording of it. Right. Mm-hmm. So typically, these things become you put out a cast album of your show, and then people may record covers of it. There is an important distinction that almost nobody pays any attention to, which is that the compulsory license in the copyright code has a specific exclusion for dramatic work. So someone can record a few songs from your show if you've already put the songs out into the world on a commercial recording. They cannot record a cast album of your show without your permission, because that's essentially a grand rights use of all those songs together. So often when we well, I shouldn't say often, occasionally we find out that there's some rip-off cast album of fill in the blanks for the show. But most often record labels know that they have to go for permission. So if there's a revival, you need to get permission as part of your deal for producing the revival. And it's why we don't have, automatically every regional theater that does The Sound of Music does their own song. Right. So anyway, so the way to if you think that people are going to be covering your songs, registering with Harry Fox is a pretty good idea. Chances, but if you have a music publisher that represents your songs, you don't necessarily need to do that. The publisher will have your song information in their database, and someone will go to the publisher and say, can I have a mechanical license to record a cover of X? And if you do a deal with a record label for a cast album, they're going to pay you those mechanical royalties. Typically, for cast albums, there's a discount rate for physical cast albums, because essentially the idea being that the same for unless it's a jukebox show, for most musicals, if a cast album is going to be written by the same person or two people who wrote all the songs in the show, right? So they're going to get all the mechanical royalties from that. So typically, because cast albums tend to have a lot of tracks compared to a pop album, interstitial things and reprises and other things, you do a discounted rate for mechanical royalties for the physical albums. On the digital side, you pay the statutory rate for everything. Digital permanent downloads have really fallen way, 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 way down in the both in the overall music business and for theater, mainly because streaming has replaced it. If you can pay $10 a month to have access to pretty much everything that's commercially released, it's unlikely that you would also pay to have a permanent download.
But isn't like an interactive stream, meaning like some kind of, I don't fully understand, because I think it's a really subtle difference, but there are some programs where you could tell it what you want to play, what you want to hear, and others where you get kind of like to pick your genre, but not the song. And mine was under the understanding that if I get to pick the song, that's actually money that I should be capturing under the mechanical right. And then how would I get that money if it were playing on Spotify and somebody's playing my song over and over?
Right. So if you have a music publisher, getting your money from the streaming services is easy, because they'll have either a direct deal with the major streaming services or have done one through the PROs. The PROs will capture, in the US, will capture, if your song is registered, the performance component of that. Remember earlier I said that the streaming service has both a performance component and a mechanical component. So they'll capture the performance component, so if your song's registered with ASCAP and BMI, they'll get that piece. The mechanical piece is a big question, particularly for independent songwriters who don't have music publishers. And that is one of the main pieces of the Music Modernization Act, which is called the Mechanical Licensing Collective, which is a organization and a giant piece of software that's being built as a result of the Music Modernization Act that is a data clearinghouse for, in theory, all songs. So all the music publishers are going to push their data into this database and attempt to create that one-to-many relationship between the songwriter piece and the various recordings of it. In some cases, there may only be one. In some cases, there may be dozens. So that the MLC for interactive digital streaming will have the ones where you can pick your song, like Spotify or Apple Music. The services will be able to go to the MLC, say, this song was played, this many times, streamed this many times, and therefore we owe this publisher, this songwriter, this amount of money. And obviously, of the things that get played, the vast majority of them are major things for which the publisher is known and the songwriter is known. But there's a chunk of it that is not that. And so a lot of independent songwriters have made a lot of noise about making sure they have representation on the MLC so that they can get paid for those things, so that the credit, in theory, then an independent songwriter should eventually be able to they should be able to, well, in a sense, they register their work with the MLC and get paid on the mechanical portion of those downloads. Now, if you're an independent songwriter who does not have a music publisher, who does not have a record label, and you use TuneCore or DistroKid or one of the other services to put your album onto the streaming services, then as it's streamed, the streaming service should be paying the service that you've chosen, TuneCore, DistroKid, CD Baby, whatever, and they in turn would be paying you on both the mechanical piece of it and the record side piece of it, because you're also the record label in that scenario. Oh, okay. So, if you make a studio concept album of your show in your basement during quarantine and you put it up on the streaming service through one of those services, you should still be getting paid on that.
Okay, so that's something you should probably check, right? That you wherever you're putting it up, you want to know that the place is going to actually be capturing this income. Otherwise, you have to somehow
chase after it. Yeah.
Chase after it, and you would contact this collective. I mean, are they even?
Eventually, you would.
Yet?
Yeah.
They're not even.
They have a deadline. I think it's the end of next year where they're required to be fully up and functioning. But as you can imagine, it's a huge administrative and data job of pulling all that stuff together. Just first of all, determining what format the data needs to be in when they get it from the publishers and songwriters, and then how it's going to be processed, because you're talking about, many, many millions of songs, which each have multiple recordings.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I want to talk. Is anyone's head spinning? See, this is why it's so important because I feel like, for me anyway, I need to keep hearing these things over and over until I finally get it. It's like, wow.
When I started doing music publishing, it's a lot of minutia, and it's sort of like during the housing crash, reading about credit default swaps and mortgages and things like that. Like you read the book and you feel real smart for about 15 minutes, and then if somebody asks you about it over drinks the next day, you're like, I don't really know.
I don't know anything. I want to talk briefly about like the third, I think, major use, which is sync licenses. Oh wait, can I just ask one question before we move on? You did mention sheet music, and somebody had actually asked me this and written in. Who's printing the sheet music these days? Like because it used to be the music publisher, right? Or and then you would get your sheet music out there. But nowadays, how do we make sure we're capturing the sheet music?
Right. So most of the time these days, most of the music publishers, even the classical ones, are not physically printing the sheet music themselves. Most of them either discontinued or sold off their sheet music business. So and really even in the last year, there's been a lot of pre-COVID, there's been a lot of consolidation in the sheet music business. So the major players really are Hal Leonard and Alfred, and on the physical side, they also have digital business. On the purely digital side, it's Music Notes and a few others. So that business has really shrunk to some extent. But it does still help to have, you can do your own deal with any of those people. And if they think that your stuff will sell, they'll do a deal with you. There is some work on their behalf, editorial work and formatting work and other things. It is helpful in a lot of those cases, because it's consolidated, to have a music publisher who in turn has a deal with them, so that you will ultimately make a little bit less money than if you had a direct deal. But the publisher is, because of their larger deal with them, is able to, for lack of a better term, push them to do projects that they may not otherwise do. So, if you represent, as I do, the rights to Hamilton, then, they really want to put the book out to sell.
Right.
If you represent the rights to a show, a collection of songs from a show they've never heard of, then, they're going to be less incentivized. But if you're represented by a publisher, they may be able to say, hey, let's try it. For instance, let's put it out digital sheets first and see if there's a demand for it. And if there is, maybe we'll do a paper folio. The challenge with paper, particularly in the theater market, is there aren't that many shops that sell physical sheet music anymore. We used to have Colony and other places. We still have was a Stage Door, I guess, on 44th and a few others. But most people are buying sheet music or doing it, physical sheet music, or doing it through Amazon or JW Pepper or someplace like that. The educational market for sheet music is a little different. So if you have songs that, if you have a show that does well and people like the songs, you can, the print publisher like Hal Leonard will also want to have one of their arrangers create a choral version or a school band version or so there's, I would say for most songwriters, sheet music is not a significant piece of their income. For theater writers, it tends to be a little bit bigger. It's maybe, depending on who you are, it may be 10%, could be 25%. It depends on how popular it is. And there are other sites like newmusicaltheater.com that have facilitated digital sheets specifically for musical theater earlier career musical theater writers, or so there are ways to get your work out there. You could also sell sheet music off your own website. If you could figure out a way to use Shopify or figure out a way to do that.
Okay. I just wanted to touch quickly on sync licenses, and I know we have a ton of questions, so I don't want to monopolize you, but I kind of do. But but I'm going to let other people have a turn. Just in terms of sync license, I don't know how much this comes up, for theater artists, but that's sort of the one area where there maybe isn't a representative, there isn't like a big music publisher standing in your way, right? That's sort of the area where they have to come directly to the author.
Well, it depends on what it is. If you don't have a music publisher and you have really popular work, which is an unusual combination, because most people that have really popular work that people would know have a music publisher. Sync went from synchronization, which is synchronization of music with picture. And so that can be film, TV, advertising, video games, some digital uses. Usually for things like YouTube, the music publishers have a blanket agreement with the service and the ability to take things down if they want to. But sync went from being something that was nice that happened every once in a while to a significant piece of music publishers' income. Because the fees can be quite large, depending on what the use is. So, using your song in a documentary might be a few $100, but or on PBS, but using your song in, a big moment in a TV show could be tens of thousands of dollars. In a giant feature film, it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, theater writers don't have that happen a huge amount. In part, a lot of feature films that are big feature films tend to be all instrumental scores, or if they use songs, they want current, pop rock songs. But there are smaller feature films or indie films or other things where, particularly, I found over the years where there's a very specific period the film is set in, or sort of a stylized thing. You can have things like Baz Luhrmann's films that use music in all different ways, like they do in the stage show Moulin Rouge. And so for synchronization, there's the passive version of it, where depending on how many songs a publisher has in their catalog, they have people who just take incoming requests, like the music supervisor for a TV show or a ad agency or whatever knows they want to use a specific song and find out how much it costs. Or you can have and you can have a team that also proactively pitches songs in the catalog for those kind of uses. So sometimes the supervisor will come and say, we really want this Beatles song, but Sony's going to charge too much for it. So what have you got that's sort of in that vibe? Mm-hmm. And so the people who work in synchronization departments of music publishing houses really have to know their catalog, not just songwriters and titles, but they need to know the substance of the music, because they need to be able to do that. So at Concord, we have, Boozy and Hawkes classical things. We have metal, we have jazz, we have Americana and folk and theater and lots of different things. And so our sync team, although some of them have specializations, they really need to all know a lot of the different genres in the catalog, because sometimes you can find a creative way to do that. Another aspect to it is writing songs for a specific project, and a publisher can help you with that in getting you the gig and also negotiating the fee. So sync fees, unlike everything else, are totally willing buyer, willing seller transactions. So if somebody really wants to use something and has their heart set on it, they can, you can set a high price. If they have a tiny budget for a little indie film, then you have to decide whether putting the song in there is, worthwhile.
How do you get in the ear of these sort of sync folks? So say I'm a writer and Concord's representing me, and I would love for them to get my songs on a television show. Is there a way to kind of get known?
Right. So if you have a music publisher that represents you, they would have a sync team that they would hopefully automatically feed anything new that comes in. Mm-hmm. Now, the trick with sync is they need a recording in order to pitch it. And so, if what you're handing them is a cast album from 1950, unless the song use is really specific, they're not going to want to use that. They're going to want to use something more contemporary or whatever. So sometimes it's about figuring out, this song is perfect, we need to find the right person to cover it to use in this context. The trick with sync is it often happens quickly, unless it's a movie with a long lead time, particularly for television. If the music supervisor for the TV show says, we really want this song, but they don't have the right recording for it, then, it may take too long to make that recording to get it to them. If it's, in the heyday of Glee, they were obviously making their own recordings in the context of the show. So that was great, because then if they decided they wanted to use something, they would record it for the show and you didn't need to worry about it. Usually the sync fees there, and we're talking about like 2009 to 2011 or so, the sync fees weren't that large. They were, for a popular show, they were like $25,000. But the at that time, because there was no streaming, the downloads of the tracks were huge. If you remember, like every week they would put out essentially a digital EP of the songs that were on that week's show. And, we had things like Don't Rain on My Parade from Funny Girl. It was that track was downloaded 250,000 times. And I would bet that 249,000 of those people had never heard that song before. So, because it was, 14-year-olds who were watching Glee.
Sure.
So anyway, so that, there are unusual uses for that. And so whenever we sign somebody, if they have a catalog that comes with it, we feed that catalog to the sync team and the recordings that go with it so they can familiarize themselves with it. We try and make some, as the A&R team, we try and make some recommendations and say, like, this song or this song or this song might be good for these sorts of uses. But yeah, if you're trying to do it on your own, it's very difficult. And if you are doing that, make sure that your website has all of your contact info and links to all of your recordings on Bandcamp or wherever they live, so that if a music supervisor happens to find your thing and wants to use it, they know where to go.
Last little question. We're talking about all these amazing music supervisors that are going to totally put our songs in, but sometimes it doesn't work out and we want to get out of our deals. What are sort of the ways of, if we want to move on from a publisher, if we want to break up with all these people that we've signed up with, how can we do that? Especially like when we've offered long terms of copyright. I mean, it seems like we're really stuck.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If you've done a deal, if you've done a co-pub deal or a life of copyright deal where they own and administer your work forever or until you can do terminations, it's pretty hard to get out, particularly because they've also probably paid you in advance that they're going to be recouping against. Typically, the way it works for shorter term administration deals, which is most of what I do with theater writers, is at the end of the term, provided you're recouped, we have a short collection period to collect on licenses that we've issued during the term. So if, let's say we did a sync license for a movie, but the movie doesn't come out until the year after your deal's up, we still collect on that deal and do that because we did the work. But at the end of that collection period, well, your rights can go away, and at the end of that collection period, we're all done. There's also a provision that if you get to the end of your term and you have an unrecouped balance, so we paid you something at the beginning, it hasn't recouped, you have the option to buy yourself out of extending by paying back usually a small premium on whatever the remaining balance is. So if we pay you $50,000 and 3 or 4 or 5 years later, you still have $5,000 left on your deal and your deal is going to keep extending until that's paid off, you could pay back $6,000 and get out of it. I'm just using these numbers as a vague example. So, there are times when people aren't happy with their publishers anymore. Sometimes that
like pulled out of the catalog, or they just seem to not be
claiming
your song.
Right, if they're not being proactive, if they're not, and sometimes personnel leaves. The person that signed you there has moved on to another job for whatever reason, and I've had that scenario myself, and I've a bunch of writers that I signed at my prior job are now represented by me there because they're more interested in being represented by me and whatever team I'm with than just the institution of the prior thing. But it can vary. and there are ways to get out of it. You can't, getting out of it if you're just unhappy is tricky, but you usually have to be concrete reasons for it.
Gotcha. Okay, Amy, I've used a lot of the time up, but maybe we can throw a couple easy questions. So what I would say is that anyone who doesn't get their question answered can always write into the VA help desk, and one of the staff attorneys will get back to you, and you can access us online and just submit your questions there. But Sean, if it's okay, we'll just throw a bunch of easy questions your way.
I go a lot of places during the day. Sometimes I go downstairs, sometimes I come back.
Well, you might be time for your downstairs jaunt, so we won't be taking too much of your time. But
Sure.
I know there's a whole bunch of questions in here, so I do want to give other people a chance. But
yeah, so we're gonna kind of hop around a little bit, just to get because there's lots of different topics here. So I'm going to start with what is required to register a song? Is a digital recording sufficient, or do you need to have sheet music?
Are you talking about copyright registration?
That let's say copyright registration, and then let's say registration with ASCAP and or BMI.
Right.
Or BMI.
So ASCAP, the PROs do not require you to submit any proof of the song, really, unless there's a dispute, but that's pretty rare. The ASCAP and BMI is really data registration. The Copyright Office does need a deposit copy, so you need to have some sort of delivery of it, and usually it has to be written down. It doesn't have to be, elaborately arranged or whatever, but it has to be fixed in a tangible medium of expression, as the law goes. So I believe they'll accept recordings for PA copyrights, but I'd have to check. To be honest with you, I've never done that process myself. I have a department that does it for us. A lot of it, though, is data. It's sort of data first, and then proof chugging along later. Currently, there was post 9/11, there was a lot of issues about mail and other things, and so but you need to have it fixed in some sort of tangible medium. I'm not sure what the rules are in accepting digital copies at this point. I know they were resistant to it for a long time.
So how does somebody who's maybe new in the business approach music publishers, or is it better to have an agent when approaching publishers?
So if you're primarily a theater writer and you want a music publishing deal, you normally have to have a show that has been produced or is about to be produced, because it's very difficult for a music publisher to exploit your work on your behalf if there's nothing to tie it to. Most of the deals that I've done have been with writers who either have had work produced or have had recordings made or other things, so that we can build on that work. If you just, if you haven't had any productions of your work, it's really hard to get a music publisher to pay attention, because nobody knows it yet, and starting your work entirely from a publishing point of view as opposed to a production point of view is hard. We do a fair amount of, and I've done a fair amount of songwriter development, early career songwriter development, and sort of help some people along with their show early on, but that's pretty rare. Most of the time it's having had some production somewhere.
Do you register the melody separately from the lyrics? Also, do you register music arrangements? So I think this is for copyright registration.
Yeah. So no, you can register music and lyrics separately. That's fine. Or you can register it together and write who wrote what. You also don't have to register each song individually. You can register a collection of songs, whether those are a collection of songs that's on an album or all the songs in your musical. So you don't need to pay a separate fee for each song. The arrangements are different. Arrangements that are most often arrangements of public domain songs you can register as you as the arranger, because it's a public domain underlying work, and you own the derivative work that's the arrangement of that work. So there's lots of registrations of different arrangements of, Star Spangled Banner, whatever. If you arrange someone else's work, you can't just do it on your own and then register your arrangement. You have to get permission from them to do the arrangement. And often you as the arranger do not retain the copyright in what you've done. So it becomes, if let's say you want to do an arrangement of a pop song that you really like, you can go to the publisher and get permission, but they may really only want to give you permission to perform that live yourself, or possibly to sell sheet music on your website. But they don't want you to try and go to Hal Leonard and say, I did a great arrangement of Hero by Beyonce and you should publish this one. The songwriters have if it's still under copyright, the songwriters have the right to authorize derivative works as one of their core rights. And so the arrangement would be something like that.
There's a question about Harry Fox. Does Harry Fox collects only on physical mechanicals?
They collect on physical and digital permanent download mechanicals. They don't collect on streaming mechanicals, to the best of my knowledge. They were originally owned by the National Music Publishers Association, and then NMPA sold them a few years ago, and I believe now they're owned by CSAC, the PRO. So I don't think they collect on streaming mechanicals. I think that's done directly from the streaming services.
Great. So let's see.
But check that, because I don't know for sure.
So I want to touch base a little bit on live streaming, just because that's become the new, that's what everyone's doing now. So a live stream musical should pay the songwriters the grand rights license, a mechanical license, and a sync license?
No. Most often, if you're doing a stream, if let's say you've written a musical, the licensing house represents the musical, and we've obviously run into a lot of this over the last 7 months. The stock and amateur licensing house generally does not get streaming rights as part of their representation agreement of your work. So we've had, as Concord Theatricals, we've had to go back to hundreds of authors and agents and say, hey, can we have these kinds of streaming rights for the shows? But when that is done, it is only paid as if it were a grand right, because they're doing the whole show. So whatever fee that the licensing house is charging, in addition to, or instead of, in some cases, the typical license fee, because we're not, in most cases, you don't have people physically sitting in a theater, so you don't calculate it the same way. That grand right license is paid. We don't pay separately on mechanicals or performance or anything else, mainly because of the restrictions that we place on how you can do it. You can't sell tickets to, you can't, if you had a 500 seat auditorium, you can't sell 10,000 tickets to each performance, and you can't put it up on YouTube for anyone to watch at any time for free, and and so it's really just, in that case, it's one thing. And likewise, since we're talking about this in this context, if you have a film and TV adaptation of your stage musical made, the music publisher typically only participates in the mechanicals and associated performance from the soundtrack. They do not take a piece of the money that's coming in. This is if it was originally written for the stage and it's made into a movie. and sometimes commissioning any new songs that the fees for any new songs you may write. But that's because it's a big grand right that's given to the studio to make that movie. It isn't split off into sync rights and other things. It's a little different for jukebox shows, but that's too complicated to go into right now.
But if people just start singing their songs on Zoom for a reading or for whatnot, I mean, I suppose if I got a bunch of authors together and say I want to have a benefit show for tonight and everyone's going to sing their songs, then I could be collecting live performance, right?
Well, it depends on how you're delivering it. If you're delivering it via YouTube, then in theory there would be, let's say your example, a benefit, as we've all seen lots of. You still need sync permission for those songs. For most of them, a lot of the music publishers have been granting gratis rights for those kinds of benefits, particularly if it's specifically for charity as opposed to selling tickets for something else. And almost all those things are at MFN, most favored nations rate. So it means that if I'm the music publisher and I'm giving you the right to sing Climb Every Mountain for your online benefit for fill in the blank theater, then as long as no other publisher is getting paid for their songs in the event, then we're not either. But if somebody gets paid, then we all get paid. So typically for benefits, those sorts of things are donated in a sense, just as they would be if you were doing the benefit in person.
Right, but if not, then it would be a sync. It wouldn't be okay.
It would be sync and performance, but the performance part of it would be covered by either the publisher or the PRO's license with YouTube.
Okay, that's another thing we didn't talk about. That's
I have actually kind of a follow-up question to that. So say in this new, there's a musical theater class that is learning about, they're learning about musicals, and the teacher wants to use examples of, current musical theater. Can a teacher use play music in a Zoom classroom?
Yeah, so I think most publishers have taken the view in the current circumstance that the same rules should apply to a Zoom classroom as they do to a physical classroom. So educational institutions have broad rights to use things in examples in a classroom context. Now, if they're going to perform a work, they should buy the scripts or buy the sheet music or whatever. But it has to be within the context of that class. If you start letting members of the public in, or if it becomes a for-profit ticket sold thing, then that's a whole different issue. But most of us have felt that, I think that if, especially given the current circumstances, that we want, however it might be possible for kids to be able to learn. And there's a lot of college performing arts programs that where, the kids are having to learn on Zoom, how to perform from their kitchen. So it's, we have a lot of sympathy for that. We don't want them using illegal sheet music to learn it from, but as long as the copies are purchased legally, then the performance or the sync aspect of it is really covered, as long as it's within the educational context and within the online classroom.
So just to follow up on that, if somebody records their class and then wants to post it on their website,
that's a whole different thing.
That's different.
Yeah, because then it's public.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Or they post it as like a webinar, but you have to pay for it.
Right. Well, again, then you're charging for it, and so then the people whose work is in it ought to be paid for something for it. I'm not saying it's going to be exorbitant, but sync fees again are willing buyer, willing seller. So the publisher could name a ridiculous price or something reasonable. It's entirely up to them.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice for songwriters who perform their own work? Can publishers still help us? does working as a songwriter with a publisher help to promote people as performers to companies in pop? So this is more, rather than theater, I think this is more mainstream.
Yeah, it can. It really depends on the publisher. Some publishers that do multi-genre stuff have, since I do the theater part of Concord, I have colleagues who do pop and other genres. We do collaborate pretty well. Concord tends to be more genre agnostic than most. Some other places I've worked, it really depends on the whim of their colleague in the pop side in this case, to say, hey, can we put this theater songwriter with these pop songwriters and have them try and write? And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I'll be honest, it doesn't work very often. In a lot of cases, not always. Excuse me 1 second. My middle school is in my house is winding down. So 1 sec, I'll be right back.
Very good. Actually, this is a perfect opportunity. I have a question, Deb, that I think you can answer. So we have a question about a writer who wants to include a Cole Porter song from 1929,
Okay.
in a play with music. And they're wondering if a Cole Porter song from 1929 is in the public domain, and can it be sung a cappella? And would that make it?
The a cappella part doesn't make a difference. No, it is not in the public domain. I can tell you because I used to represent Cole Porter, the Cole Porter Trust in this music publishing. No, in the U.S., the clock started running forward last year, the year before. And so for a while it was frozen because of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act in 1998. The rule was anything pre-1923 was public domain. And now it's started rolling forward a year at a time. So we haven't quite hit 1929 yet. So
I think we're at 1924.
I think we're at 24 right now.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So just a few more years.
Yeah. But you can go to Warner Chappell and try and get a license.
Okay, so I have one more question. It's a little specific, so I'm not sure if we're going to be able to answer it fully. And then, of course, if you have any questions that we were able to not get to, or you need a little bit more depth in the answer, please contact us on the help desk on our website. So we have a question from a member who approached Warner Music, and they gave him a verbal okay to use a song that they own, but not in writing. Is the verbal okay to use a song in their work okay, or should he get something in writing saying that he can use the song?
You definitely want it in writing, yeah, and they have forums for that, so it's not hard for them to do if they actually want to give you the permission to do it.
All right. I think that was our last question, right? Unless
I
just want to thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Sean. I can't thank you enough. And if you guys like this type of programming, please let us know. Contact me. I'm going to be at the dgcm.org. You can always write into me over there. Let us know so that we can continue to bring this type of stuff for you, whether it's Copyright Advocacy Month or not. Sean, you are an incredible resource, and I can't thank you enough. It's been a real dream of mine since I started to look towards the DGCM more and more to talk with you or someone that knows. So I do appreciate your generosity of your time and for being here with us.
Yeah, happy to do it. It's
all right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And just there was one, I think I saw something in the chat. Somebody was asking about a flow chart of all of this. The music committee is working on a flow chart about how all of this works. So look forward to that very, very soon. We are currently working on a flow chart.
Yep.
So, and we did, and I know it was a lot of information. We are recording this session. It will be available later on our website, so you can watch this over and over and over and understand exactly how these music rights work. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.